Hello, my name is Vertus, and I'm a Christian. That is how I began one of my first sermons at the Universalist Church of Rochester about 12 years ago. In that sermon, I preached about my journey from Holiness Pentecostalism to Unitarian Universalism. And for the most part, it was a smooth transition, except for my grappling with one of the main tenets of universalism, universal salvation. And at that time, I had been introduced to the concept by reading Bishop Carlton Pearson's The Gospel of Inclusion and listening to an awesome yet troubling sermon by African-American UU minister and historian, the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed. His sermon was entitled, Dragged, Kicked, Kicking, and Screaming into Heaven. Coming from a faith that focused on the fear of God and being sent into the fiery pits of hell for even the finite sin, the concept of sinners reconciling with the divine and being welcomed into the loving arms did not sit well with me. Although it was comforting, as my previous faith taught that my sexuality was a dire sin. But evildoers as well? The audacity. I struggled, and to a degree still struggle, to be honest, with that concept. I've toiled with universalism in its Christian form, the belief that in the end, all creation and every human being will be reconciled to God or to the divine. For the belief that if God is the creator of all things, it would seem to be a failure of love to bring into existence beings who are going to end up suffering eternal punishment. A belief in its basic form that an all-loving divine would bring us into existence only in the confidence that our final good could be achieved. It speaks to our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It speaks to our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, love, and justice for all. And also our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. But that includes the good as well as the bad, all sharing the same eternal fate, all reconciling in the love of the divine, even if they have to be dragged kicking and screaming into heaven. This was not an easy belief to adopt. You see, around that time, 12 years ago, my grandmother had recently passed away at the age of 98 years old. And for those that follow me on social media, you know that I have been working on my family history since high school. And my grandmother's recollections have fueled me and continues to nourish this pursuit. Some of you I know have been reading My Grandmother's Hands, a racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies. It's on my list. So please let me know if you would like to read it with me. Well, my grandmother's hands were coarse from a lifetime of farm labor, yet soft to touch. And her skin was dark like mine. Her smile was loving. Her smile was a lot like mine. When she smiled, her eyes disappeared, and all you saw were high cheekbones, and it was infectious. And I remember going to her farm in Georgia, seeing red clay for miles and miles. I could still see it. I can still smell it. I have fond memories of her farm. including the hogs and the piglets that she raised. And her cooking was divine. Talk about divine. Well, when I was in high school, I would call her to ask her questions about my ancestry. And she told me that it was on a red hill that her grandfather, Reuben Walls, was born enslaved. My grandmother told me that when Reuben was 9 years old and was working in the fields with his twin sister, Ilse, all of the enslaved people on the Walls plantation were called to the gathering place in the middle of the slave quarters. He was short, like me. So he came up to the front so that he could see what was going on. And when he got to the front to see that Bossman Tom, is what they called him, had a whip in his hands. And then little Reuben saw his mother. She was tied to the post. And that without words, the slave master proceeded to whip her and whip her and whip her till the blood ran down her back. And she died in front of her children. You see, Red Hills red clay had more than iron in it. We still don't know what her name was. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the red hills of Georgia as if she never existed. And I can hear Reuben sing, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home." I can still hear it in my whole soul and in my bones and in my DNA. Orphaned, the women of the plantation took care of the twins in the slave quarters. And when the enslaved people were freed, Reuben remained on the plantation and worked that red clay. He eventually married and began a family of his own. He survived, but trauma did as well. In that first sermon, the thought that I would see that man in heaven troubled me. He murdered my ancestor in front of her children. How cold of a heart can you have? How evil can you truly be? But in that sermon, I spoke about what if I were to see him in heaven. I said I would ask him, not why, but what was her name? Because we don't know. He tried to erase her from memory. There are no records that she even existed, no tombstone, nothing. Just the occasional breakdown of her son in front of his grandchild. That is what I said that I would have asked him. But what about now? What am I being called to now? What are we being called to now and in this time and in this place? Our board has been reading and discussing Widening the Circle of Concern, a report by the UU Commission on Institutional Change. And I am so glad about it. In one of the sections that we recently discussed, this concept of universal and collective salvation, Dr. Elias Ortega, the president of my seminary, wrote that if we believe in collective salvation, we must also believe in collective sacrifice. It is powerful that our faith community is working to reclaim this sacred practice, but he said that in claiming what is meant to be sacred in personal sacrifice without the power of we is the very thing that desecrates the practice. The belief in collective salvation means there cannot be small groups of UUs whose personal sacrifice we depend on every time to move us forward as a collective whole. That kind of hierarchical membership undermines the very inherent worth and dignity that we lift in our first principle. Living into the power of we holds us accountable to repairing the legacy of theological harm we have perpetuated against some in our community. Even in the face of oppression, suffering, legacy, and the legacy of white supremacy culture in the world, we believe that there is a way forward. He goes on to preach that to affirm the power of we as a faith community, we need to strengthen ways for our people to draw nourishment and strength from this faith. We must fashion ourselves into a faithful people who draw wisdom from our inherited tradition. This is not an individual task, but a collective practice. The power of we. It calls us to sacrifice our privilege. It calls us to sacrifice our time, our resources, and if we can get not just a few of us, well, just maybe we can make the world a better place now instead of living in the hell of homelessness, the hell of poverty, the hell of racism, the hell of war, the hell of violence and abuse, the hell of depression and helplessness. This is one thing that universalism is calling us now. And if we can achieve this, the power of we can dismantle racism and other oppressions within ourselves and our institutions. If we can achieve this, imagine what our world could be. We can live now for the sake of our own lives and the generations to come. But damn, evil still exists. Evil is rearing its ugly head right now, and I hate it. I hate everything about it. You know, in my ancestral pursuits, I have recently discovered the slave owner that murdered my ancestor. I discovered in the census record boss man Tom, or should I say Judge Thomas Anderson Walls and his slave plantation. I researched further and discovered the federal census schedule that federal slave schedule that recorded not the names, but the ages of Reuben and Ilse in 1860 listed as twins, right in the record, as being 7 years old, 2 years before they lost their mother by the hands of Judge Thomas Anderson Walls. I even found a picture of him. And when I saw that picture, I had a blood-curdling, visceral reaction to it. In fact, it was an ancestral, uncontrollable, traumatic response in which I could hear whipping, I could hear the cries. I was so hurt by it. I had hatred in my heart. I wanted to blame everyone in the world for letting that happen, for sitting back and accepting the atrocity. Yet, I was reminded of who I am, where I came from, and the fact that not only did Reuben live on, he thrived. In fact, he ended up purchasing that land that his mother died on, all 325 acres of it. And it was the homestead of my family for many generations. In fact, my late mother was raised on that land. It was the land that I visited when I was a child. as it became my grandmother's land. She was my grandfather's prayer, and I am my grandmother's dream. I am my ancestors' prayers to the divine. I am their legacy, and I have a responsibility, not to exact vengeance, but to live the best life that I can, to be good, to do good, to make them proud, to be resilient, to be bold, to be courageous, not just for myself, but for the collective now, and especially for those yet to come. Instead of fear of hell to compare me to do good and be good, I have the love of the divine. Instead of wishing for vengeance on those that do evil, I have the knowledge that they must reconcile with their God as I do mine. They will suffer, and I don't have to make them suffer, but I will do what I can in this life. And when I see her, when my life is over, I will be welcomed into an embrace of love because of the life that I have lived. Let the life I've lived speak for me, and that is good news. Let people be evil, but resist them. Let me say that again. Let people be evil, but resist them. Let people harm, but resist them by healing those they have harmed. Come what may, we will sacrifice what we can to heal this world. Come what may, we will be resilient and we will go on. We will live on, and I will honor my ancestral mother, and we will see her again. And she will say, well done, my son. And I will say, well done, my mother. Your legacy lives on. So let us resist evildoers. Let us do what we can, when we can, to love ourselves and this world enough to save it. Let the audacity of universalism save us all. And let us do it together. Can I get an amen in here? All right. And blessed be Ashe. And may it be so. Whew. So please rise in body and spirit and actually sing with your mask on. We're going to sing this morning. We're going to sing this morning. And when you're at home, join in from home and sing out loud our closing hymn, 131, which is in the gray hymnal, 131, Love Will Guide Us.